Batman's moral code, often perceived as a straightforward system of justice, is far more than a set of ethical guidelines. Rather, it is a complex psychological construct, deeply rooted in his trauma and his attempt to find control in a world that has been defined by chaos and loss. At first glance, Batman's refusal to kill criminals seems noble, his desire to uphold justice and protect Gotham from becoming like the very criminals he seeks to stop. However, as we peel back the layers of his psyche, we come to understand that this rigid moral code is more than just a reflection of his ethical stance. It is a mask that hides deeper emotional scars and unresolved trauma. The death of his parents, witnessed at a young age, set the foundation for Batman's psychological world. That trauma, which shaped his mission, also locked him in a psychological cage where he couldn't escape the overwhelming feelings of guilt, helplessness, and rage. In this context, Batman's moral code becomes an attempt to regain control over a world where he once felt utterly powerless. His insistence on not killing criminals is not just a moral stance, it is a reflection of his internal battle to maintain a sense of purity in his quest for justice. By refusing to kill, Batman hopes to distance himself from the very darkness that claimed his parents. However, this obsession with moral purity blinds him to the fact that his actions, while driven by good intentions, often perpetuate a cycle of violence, punishment, and retribution, leaving Gotham in a constant state of crisis, unable to fully heal itself. This moral rigidity, symbolized by his refusal to kill, often leads Batman into contradictory behavior, where his actions fail to align with the ideals he wishes to embody. For instance, while Batman's rule of not killing criminals is a cornerstone of his moral framework, he frequently uses extreme violence to subdue his enemies. His methods often involve torture, intimidation, and the coercion of information, reflecting a moral ambiguity that challenges his stated principles. Batman's struggle to maintain his non-lethal stance while simultaneously engaging in brutal methods highlights the psychological tension within him. The battle between his ideals of justice and the darker aspects of his own nature. The need for control becomes clear in Batman's moral code. By refusing to kill, he defines his mission not just in terms of justice, but as an act of self-discipline, an ongoing effort to guard against his own darker impulses. The refusal to kill is symbolic of Batman's attempt to control his inner chaos, but it also reflects his fear of crossing a line that could mean he is no different from the very criminals he hunts. This deep fear of becoming what he hates is a core element of his psyche, motivating his need to create strict boundaries around what is acceptable behavior. However, his insistence on adhering to this moral code often causes him to become more deeply entrenched in the cycle of violence. Every criminal Batman refuses to kill is yet another instance of his psychological burden, a reminder that he cannot truly escape the trauma that shaped him. This is the paradox of Batman's moral code. It serves as a shield against his trauma, but also keeps him locked in an endless struggle, never allowing him to fully heal. The concept of justice, in Batman's mind, is deeply personal. His moral framework is not just about right and wrong, but is built on the foundation of his guilt, the belief that he must punish those who do wrong in order to atone for the death of his parents. This guilt-based motivation drives Batman to see himself not as a vigilante, but as a savior who must bear the weight of Gotham's sins. Batman's perfectionist ideals keep him from recognizing the flaws in his own approach. He believes that if he can uphold his moral purity, then perhaps he can prove to himself that he is worthy of the redemption he believes is unattainable for most others. This complex psychological motivation is further magnified by his need for control. Batman, unable to control the chaotic world around him, seeks to impose his sense of order onto Gotham, using his moral code as the foundation for that order. Gotham's descent into crime is a personal affront to him, a reminder that the city, like his own soul, is uncontrollable. His refusal to kill criminals becomes a way for Batman to differentiate himself from the chaos that swirls around him, a way to say, "I am not like them." However, this self-imposed rule is untenable, and over time, leads Batman into moral conflict. As Batman wages his personal war on crime, his refusal to kill criminals often leaves them to escape justice, perpetuating Gotham's cycle of crime and retribution. His obsession with moral purity blinds him to the consequences of his actions, creating an endless loop where he can never truly rid Gotham of the chaos he is so desperate to prevent. This moral code, born from trauma and a desire for control, ultimately traps Batman in a psychological paradox. He is trying to fix Gotham by adhering to a code that only maintains the city's dysfunction. Gotham's systemic issues are never truly addressed by Batman, as his interventions are reactionary, not proactive. Batman becomes less of a savior and more of a symptom of Gotham's endless crisis. His actions, guided by his rigid moral framework, create an illusion of progress, but ultimately prevent the city from building sustainable systems of justice that are capable of breaking free from Batman's shadow. Batman's relationship with his moral code is also characterized by a profound fear of vulnerability. By adhering to his non-lethal stance, Batman maintains an air of control that allows him to avoid confronting his own fears and insecurities. His strict moral code becomes a shield that keeps him from acknowledging the emotional damage he has sustained. By never allowing himself to kill, Batman creates a moral wall between himself and the chaotic world he inhabits, but in doing so, he isolates himself from his own humanity. His code becomes a way to justify his isolation and deny his vulnerability. The very act of adhering to this code serves as a reminder that Batman is not just trying to save Gotham, he is also trying to save himself from the psychological trauma that threatens to consume him. Batman's moral code becomes less about justice and more about self-preservation, a mask that allows him to distance himself from the pain and fear that lie at the heart of his mission. Batman's moral code is undeniably shaped by his early trauma, the night he witnessed the murder of his parents in Crime Alley. This pivotal moment left an indelible scar on his psyche, creating a deep-seated rage and guilt that would shape his actions for the rest of his life. The loss of his parents marked the beginning of Batman's moral absolutism. The trauma instilled in him a desire for retribution, an unwavering commitment to never let anyone else suffer as he did. The murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne was not just an event, it was a psychological wound that transformed Bruce Wayne from an innocent child into the tortured vigilante known as Batman. His refusal to kill criminals is the ultimate expression of his personal pain. By adhering to this moral code, Batman tells himself that he is better than the killers who destroyed his family. His non-lethal approach is, in many ways, a psychological defense mechanism, a way for him to distance himself from the darkness that he believes consumes the souls of those who kill. To kill, in Batman's mind, is to lose control, to succumb to the very darkness that claimed his parents. His refusal to kill serves as a moral boundary, a way for him to define the line between himself and the very criminals he seeks to stop. It allows him to believe that his fight for justice is not a vengeful crusade, but a quest for redemption and moral purity. However, this moral absolutism creates a psychological conflict within Batman. While his moral code may seem noble, it is ultimately an attempt to mask deeper emotional pain. Batman's rule of non-lethality is not just about preserving life. It is about protecting himself from the overwhelming fear of becoming like the criminals he hunts. If Batman kills, If he crosses that line, he believes he will lose the last vestige of control he has over his own identity. The fear of becoming a killer, of losing his humanity, drives Batman's refusal to take lives, even when faced with moral quandaries that demand such an action. This constant psychological battle between moral purity and the need for control plays out in Batman's every decision, constantly pushing him to confront the same question: what price is justice willing to pay? This internal conflict is not simply about right and wrong. It is about Batman's inability to confront his emotional wounds, specifically the grief and guilt tied to his parents' deaths. The moral code, rather than serving as a clear ethical system, becomes an emotional crutch, one that allows Batman to continue the fight for justice without ever confronting the deep-seated pain that lies beneath. His code becomes a mask, a way to maintain the illusion of control over a world that he is unable to control. Batman's constant struggle to maintain his moral boundaries reflects his psychological need to prove to himself that he is not simply driven by revenge or pain, but by something greater, a moral purpose. Yet, despite his insistence on his moral code, Batman is often confronted with the irony of his actions. In his attempts to stay true to his principles, he frequently finds that his non-lethal approach only perpetuates Gotham's crime. Villains like the Joker and Two-Face consistently escape the consequences of their actions because Batman refuses to end their lives. This moral paradox forces Batman into an uncomfortable position. His refusal to kill leads to cycles of violence where the very criminals he lets go only return to commit worse crimes. As Batman grows older, he begins to wonder if his moral purity is not a path to redemption but a trap that prevents Gotham from healing. His insistence on playing the role of the moral judge locks him in a perpetual battle, leaving Gotham to suffer at the hands of the very people Batman refuses to stop in the most effective way. In fact, the bat signal, as a tool for Batman's intervention, becomes the ultimate symbol of this moral conflict. Each time it flashes, it calls Batman to action and forces him to revisit the very struggle that defines his existence. The signal represents both the need for Batman and the tragic realization that Gotham will never truly be free from its crises until the cycle of crime is broken. Batman's obsession with maintaining his moral code blinds him to the fact that his moral absolutism is in itself a form of psychological denial, a way for him to avoid confronting the root causes of Gotham's problems and his own emotional scar tissue. By focusing on the outward appearance of justice, by adhering to his rule of no killing, Batman perpetuates the very instability he seeks to destroy. At the same time, the moral code also speaks to Batman's fear of vulnerability. His refusal to kill stems from a deeper fear, the fear that by crossing that line he will lose control over the very identity he has spent his life constructing. For Batman, the act of killing represents not just the death of the enemy, but the death of himself, the moment he becomes something less human. The fear of becoming the villain is Batman's greatest anxiety. It is the psychological wound that drives him to maintain an absolute moral framework that in truth is a mask for his fear of self-destruction. Each time the bat signal shines, Batman is called not just to stop crime, but to prove to himself that he is still human, still capable of maintaining his moral compass despite the chaos that surrounds him. His moral code, as much as it serves as a shield for justice, is ultimately a mask that protects him from the deeper truth that his own identity, much like Gotham, is built on a foundation of brokenness. Batman's strict moral code, while a shield against the chaos of Gotham and a way for him to maintain a sense of order in his world, alienates him from those closest to him. His refusal to kill criminals is not just a moral stance but also a psychological defense mechanism, one that keeps him emotionally distant from others. In his obsession with maintaining his moral purity, Batman isolates himself, unwilling to share his burden with anyone who might question or challenge his code. This emotional self-reliance is both a symptom of his trauma and a product of his fear of vulnerability. The more rigidly Batman adheres to his moral framework, the more he distances himself from his allies, who are often left to deal with the consequences of his decisions and actions without ever being able to fully engage in the decision-making process themselves. Perhaps the most poignant example of this dynamic is Batman's relationship with Alfred, his loyal butler and surrogate father. Alfred, more than anyone, understands the psychological and emotional toll that Batman's crusade takes on him. Yet, despite his deep love and concern for Bruce, Alfred is constantly forced to watch Batman push him away. Alfred knows that Bruce's moral code is, in many ways, a mask for deeper emotional wounds, but Batman's refusal to address these issues or open up emotionally keeps them from ever truly connecting. Alfred becomes the silent witness to Batman's psychological battle, offering counsel and support, but never able to reach the heart of Bruce's pain. Batman's insistence on operating alone, following his moral code without deviation, prevents him from seeking the help he needs, both emotionally and physically. This dynamic creates a profound sense of emotional isolation for Batman, as he cannot allow himself to fully trust anyone with the knowledge of his inner world. Alfred, for all his wisdom, is left to play the role of the silent observer, forced to watch as Batman spirals deeper into psychological distress, unable to break free from the moral chains that bind him. The relationship between Batman and Commissioner Gordon similarly reveals the psychological limitations of Batman's moral code. Gordon, while an ally, is often left in a subordinate position due to Batman's refusal to cooperate fully with the established legal system. Gordon understands that Gotham's systemic issues can't be solved solely by Batman's methods, but Batman's moral absolutism prevents him from acknowledging that fact. This dynamic creates a sense of frustration in Gordon, as he is forced to work alongside a vigilante who, despite his good intentions, often operates outside the law, bypassing the very institutions that Gordon is trying to reform. Batman's refusal to kill and his insistence on working outside the legal system create a tension in their relationship, where Gordon is often forced to accept Batman's methods, even when they contradict his own beliefs in due process and law. Despite their deep mutual respect, Batman's refusal to acknowledge the validity of Gordon's system perpetuates a cycle of dependency that keeps Gotham from addressing its problems in a more systemic and sustainable way. In Robin, we see how Batman's rigid moral code negatively affects his relationship with those who might otherwise be seen as his equals. Robin, especially in his early years, is driven by the desire to fight for justice and prove himself alongside Batman. However, as he grows older and becomes more aware of his own moral compass, Robin begins to realize the flaws in Batman's worldview. Robin, unlike Batman, is not bound by the same moral absolutes and is willing to make tougher choices when faced with difficult situations. This leads to a fracture in their relationship, as Robin becomes increasingly frustrated with Batman's unwillingness to compromise on his principles. For Robin, the moral rigidity that defines Batman's approach to justice becomes a source of personal conflict. He begins to question whether Batman's moral code is ultimately helping Gotham or simply keeping the city trapped in a never-ending cycle of violence and retaliation. Robin's departure from Batman is in part a reaction to Batman's psychological refusal to evolve, to rethink his code in light of the long-term consequences of his actions. Robin, as a younger man, represents the possibility of growth and change, something that Batman is psychologically unable to do because of his attachment to his moral code. This psychological conflict also plays out in Batman's personal life, particularly with his romantic relationships. Batman's refusal to let anyone truly see him or understand him emotionally prevents him from forming meaningful relationships. His interactions with characters like Catwoman and Talia al Ghul demonstrate the tension between Batman's desire for connection and his fear of vulnerability. Batman's strict moral framework creates an emotional barrier that keeps him from being able to let down his guard and share his true self with others. His relationships become transactional rather than emotional, where intimacy is defined by shared goals, that is, in fighting crime, rather than true emotional connection. This prevents him from fully engaging in any personal relationship, as he is constantly haunted by the fear that opening up will make him vulnerable to further pain. Batman's inability to let go of his moral code leads to a constant cycle of isolation and internal conflict. Despite his outward appearance as a hero, he is psychologically locked in a battle between his idealism and his trauma. His insistence on not crossing moral boundaries serves as a psychological defense against the deep-seated guilt he feels over the death of his parents. Batman's moral code becomes a way for him to maintain a sense of control over his life, but it also keeps him trapped in a loop of self-punishment, fear, and denial. The emotional distance he creates between himself and others, coupled with his constant refusal to allow anyone to share his burden, perpetuates his psychological stagnation. Batman, by adhering to his rigid moral framework, avoids confronting the very pain that drives him to be a vigilante in the first place. At the heart of Batman's moral code lies a fundamental contradiction: his refusal to kill. On the surface, this moral stance seems clear-cut. Batman refuses to take lives because he believes it is a line that, once crossed, would make him no better than the criminals he fights. His non-lethal rule serves as his defining ethical boundary, a principle that sets him apart from the very people he strives to stop. However, this absolute adherence to non-lethality often results in moral inconsistencies in Batman's actions. Despite his pledge to never kill, Batman is frequently involved in situations where his actions have deadly consequences. He uses extreme force, torture, and intimidation to extract information from criminals, often leaving them physically broken or psychologically scarred. Batman's reliance on violence to achieve his goals creates an ethical paradox. While he refuses to kill, his methods often result in severe harm to those he seeks to stop. The psychological toll of this contradiction weighs heavily on Batman, as it forces him to grapple with the idea that in many ways his moral code is not truly protecting Gotham, but rather perpetuating the cycle of violence. This contradiction reflects a deeper psychological issue: Batman's obsession with control and his need for order. His refusal to kill is, in part, an attempt to maintain control over the chaotic forces that drive Gotham's criminal underworld. Killing, in Batman's mind, is an act of loss of control, an admission that justice can only be achieved through finality, something he refuses to accept. However, this drive for control leads to moral compromise. While Batman's refusal to kill is meant to preserve his moral purity, his methods often deviate from his ideals, revealing the psychological conflict at the heart of his mission. Batman's moral absolutism, the belief that he must never compromise his principles, leads to a constant cycle of failure, where the very code he holds dear becomes a psychological prison. His unwillingness to adapt or rethink his approach to justice prevents him from seeing the bigger picture, that his code is not saving Gotham, but rather keeping it trapped in a state of perpetual crisis. This internal cognitive dissonance causes significant psychological distress for Batman. On the one hand, he believes his refusal to kill is the ultimate form of justice, the only thing that separates him from the criminals he pursues. On the other hand, he sees the consequences of his actions. The criminals he lets go often return to commit worse crimes, and Gotham remains in a state of constant fear. This dissonance is particularly evident in his relationship with the Joker, who embodies the ultimate moral challenge to Batman's code. The Joker's chaotic nature forces Batman to confront the limits of his own morality as he faces a villain who repeatedly tests the boundaries of his non-lethal rule. The Joker's constant provocations, his willingness to kill and destroy, force Batman into a position where his code no longer seems like a moral choice, but an emotional crutch, one that prevents him from taking decisive action when the city truly needs him. The psychological toll of Batman's unwillingness to kill in the face of overwhelming evil causes a crippling inner conflict, one that continually undermines his sense of moral clarity and personal peace. The Joker, in many ways, represents the mirror image of Batman's own psyche. He is the chaotic force that Batman tries to keep at bay, and in doing so, the Joker forces Batman to confront his own darkness. Batman's refusal to kill the Joker can be seen as a way for him to maintain his moral superiority. He refuses to engage in the very violence that the Joker represents. Yet, this refusal also reflects Batman's fear of failure and his desire for control. By refusing to kill the Joker, Batman believes he is keeping himself separate from the criminal he seeks to defeat. But in doing so, he creates a moral paradox, where his refusal to end the Joker's life allows the villain to continue wreaking havoc on Gotham. The Joker's willingness to engage in unpredictable violence forces Batman to confront the fact that his moral code, built on the refusal to kill, is actually a mask for his deeper psychological issues. Batman's moral absolutism prevents him from truly confronting the reality of Gotham's crisis, that it is not just criminals that need to be dealt with, but the very systems that perpetuate crime and injustice. Furthermore, Batman's constant refusal to compromise on his principles reflects a psychological rigidity that prevents him from evolving as a person and a hero. In many ways, Batman's adherence to his moral code keeps him stuck in the past, unable to let go of the trauma that has defined his identity. His desire to maintain a perfect moral code is, at its core, a defense mechanism, a way to avoid confronting the grief and fear that still haunt him. Batman's obsession with control over Gotham's crime and his own identity becomes a form of emotional repression, as he refuses to allow himself to truly feel or heal from his trauma. This psychological repression is symbolized by the mask of Batman, which he wears as both a symbol of justice and a way to shield himself from the emotional pain of his past. This need for perfection in his moral code also leads Batman into a cycle of self-sabotage. His refusal to allow for compromise creates an unrealistic expectation of himself and his allies. Batman expects himself to be the ultimate arbiter of justice, and he places that expectation on everyone around him, including Commissioner Gordon, Alfred, and Robin. His moral code, in many ways, becomes a measure of their loyalty, forcing them to either comply with his vision or face the consequences of Batman's moral judgment. The tension between Batman's moral absolutism and the realities of Gotham's situation creates a psychological burden on his allies, who must constantly operate within the confines of his ideals, even when they know that compromise is sometimes necessary. Batman's fear of failure and his insistence on maintaining control becomes a psychological cage that prevents him from forming truly collaborative relationships. His rigid moral code, rather than empowering his allies, often alienates them, forcing them to either accept Batman's worldview or leave him to fight the battle alone. Batman's moral code, while serving as a defense mechanism against his inner turmoil and trauma, ultimately prevents him from achieving personal growth and forces him to live in a perpetual state of crisis. This psychological stagnation mirrors Gotham's own issues. As the city becomes increasingly dependent on Batman's interventions, unable to develop its own solutions to the problems of crime and corruption. The more Batman clings to his moral absolutes, the less likely he is to see the necessity of systemic reform in Gotham. The city's continual reliance on Batman to solve its problems reflects a fundamental flaw in Gotham's political structure, just as Batman's refusal to compromise on his moral code represents a limitation in his own ability to adapt and grow as a person and a hero. The cycle of dependency that Batman's moral code fosters prevents Gotham from achieving true self-sufficiency. The more Batman intervenes in Gotham's crises, the less the city's institutions, its police, its government, and its social systems are forced to confront the root causes of its problems. By consistently responding to crime and taking control of Gotham's justice system, Batman reinforces the belief that only he can solve the city's problems. His moral code, which refuses to kill criminals or compromise on justice, ultimately keeps Gotham locked in a state of stagnation where true reform is always just out of reach. Gotham's citizens, rather than taking ownership of their city's future, are conditioned to believe that Batman is the only solution. This reliance on an external force, Batman, prevents the city from developing a sense of self-reliance, and by extension, Gotham remains trapped in a cycle of crisis and reactionary justice. Batman's inability to evolve is reflected in his personal relationships as well. His moral absolutism creates a barrier between him and his allies, preventing him from forming genuine partnerships. Whether it's his isolation from Alfred, his strained relationship with Commissioner Gordon, or his conflict with Robin, Batman's refusal to compromise creates an emotional distance that undermines the very relationships that could support him in his mission. His moral rigidity keeps him locked in a solitary existence, one where he must constantly reinforce his own ideals and avoid vulnerability. This psychological wall prevents Batman from growing, both as a person and as a hero. His need for control over Gotham's fate leads to a loss of emotional connection with those around him, making it difficult for Batman to form lasting relationships that could help him address the deeper emotional wounds at the core of his mission. Furthermore, Batman's inability to evolve also has a profound impact on his role in Gotham's future potential. Gotham, as a city, is stunted in its growth because it cannot see past its dependence on Batman. The city's institutions, from the police force to the judicial system, become increasingly reliant on Batman to restore order rather than addressing the root causes of Gotham's corruption and crime. Batman's constant intervention prevents long-term solutions from taking hold. Reform in Gotham is always sidelined in favor of reactionary measures, where Batman's presence is seen as the only means of maintaining order. Gotham's future is shaped by short-term fixes rather than sustainable changes. Batman's moral code, while driven by a desire for justice, ultimately creates a system where self-reliance and accountability are never prioritized. Gotham's need for Batman's intervention becomes a psychological crutch, where citizens, police, and officials believe that Batman is the only one capable of keeping them safe, even though this reliance ensures that Gotham will never truly overcome its issues. In many ways, Batman's own psychological stagnation mirrors the institutional stagnation in Gotham. Both are trapped in a cycle of reaction rather than proaction. Batman, with his rigid moral code, focuses on the immediate, the crisis at hand, the criminals he must stop, and the justice he must deliver. However, this focus on immediate action comes at the cost of long-term reform and growth. Batman's moral absolutism prevents him from rethinking his approach to Gotham's problems. Instead of seeking collaborative solutions, Batman insists on maintaining his individual approach to justice, which keeps the city and himself locked in a cycle of perpetual conflict and moral rigidity. Moreover, Batman's fear of failure plays a significant role in his psychological and moral stagnation. His refusal to compromise and his insistence on following his code stem from a deep-seated fear of losing control and becoming what he despises. Batman fears that if he crosses the line, if he kills even one criminal, he will no longer be the hero. His identity, which is so intricately tied to his moral code, will be shattered. This fear of losing his moral superiority drives him to remain entrenched in his current approach, even though it is clear that Gotham's issues are not being solved. His fear of failure keeps him from reevaluating his approach to justice and from considering whether his moral code is in fact contributing to the perpetuation of Gotham's problems. The long-term consequences of this moral rigidity are devastating, not just for Batman but for the future of Gotham. Gotham's institutions, rather than evolving to handle crime and corruption, remain in a state of arrested development, waiting for Batman to act. The city's people, rather than demanding change, grow to rely on Batman's presence as a symbol of justice, but a justice that is ultimately unstable and unsustainable. As Gotham waits for Batman's intervention, it fails to take the necessary steps toward true reform. Batman, in his psychological need for control, becomes the linchpin that holds Gotham together, but he also prevents the city from achieving its own independence and long-term solutions. Batman's relationship with Robin is one of the most complex and revealing aspects of his character. While Batman takes Robin under his wing to train him as an ally and a partner in his crusade against crime, their dynamic is shaped by Batman's psychological barriers, particularly his moral code and his fear of emotional attachment. At the heart of their relationship is a significant power imbalance. Batman, as the mentor, holds the moral high ground, while Robin, the mentee, is expected to follow Batman's lead without question. However, the rigidity of Batman's moral code creates a significant psychological distance between them, one that becomes more evident as Robin matures and begins to form his own sense of justice. Batman's need to control every aspect of his life, including his interactions with Robin, is a key factor in the psychological tension between them. Batman's moral absolutism forces Robin to operate within the narrow confines of Batman's own vision of justice. Batman's refusal to compromise on his no-kill rule becomes a central aspect of their relationship, and it creates a deep psychological divide between the two. Robin, particularly in his earlier years, is eager to prove himself as a worthy ally to Batman. However, as he grows older and his understanding of morality and justice evolves, he begins to question Batman's uncompromising stance. Robin, who has a more flexible moral compass, often finds himself at odds with Batman's rigid code, leading to psychological conflict and eventually his departure from Batman's side. One of the most profound effects of Batman's rigid moral code on his relationship with Robin is the lack of room for independent thought. Batman's fear of vulnerability and his need for control prevent him from allowing Robin to make his own decisions or form his own moral beliefs. Robin is constantly forced to adhere to Batman's rules, even when those rules are not entirely aligned with his own beliefs. This dynamic stifles Robin's personal growth, as he is unable to develop his own sense of justice and is continually subjugated to Batman's moral framework. While Batman may see this as an act of protection, preventing Robin from crossing lines Batman himself refuses to cross, it ultimately creates a psychological barrier that keeps Robin from realizing his full potential as a hero. The psychological toll of this dynamic on Robin becomes particularly evident when Robin begins to question his role as Batman's sidekick. As he matures and gains experience, Robin starts to see that Batman's moral absolutism is not a sustainable or healthy way to approach justice. His own desire for a more balanced and pragmatic approach to crime fighting creates a conflict with Batman's uncompromising code. This growing psychological divide between the two leads to moments of resentment and frustration on Robin's part, as he struggles to find his own identity and sense of purpose in Batman's shadow. Robin begins to realize that his moral compass is not the same as Batman's, and that he is not able to grow as a hero if he is constantly restricted by Batman's rules. In addition, Batman's emotional isolation and fear of vulnerability further exacerbate the mentor-mentee relationship. Batman, unable to form healthy emotional bonds due to his trauma and his fear of losing control, creates an emotional distance that keeps Robin at arm's length. Despite his deep care for Robin, Batman's reluctance to show emotional openness or trust prevents him from becoming the kind of supportive mentor Robin needs. Batman's emotional withdrawal not only prevents Robin from fully trusting him, but also keeps him from forming a deep, emotional connection with someone who could help him heal. Robin, despite his loyalty, begins to feel like a mere tool in Batman's crusade against crime, rather than an equal partner. This lack of emotional reciprocity leads to resentment and confusion on Robin's part, as he begins to question why he continues to follow Batman's lead, despite the emotional and psychological toll it takes on him. Batman's refusal to allow Robin to form his own identity and pursue his own vision of justice is one of the key factors that leads to Robin's eventual departure. Robin's psychological growth demands that he break free from Batman's moral code and form his own moral identity. Batman, unable to let go of his need to control Robin's every action, cannot allow this independence to flourish. Robin's eventual departure is the result of years of emotional repression, psychological conflict, and Batman's inability to trust Robin as an equal partner. This break, while necessary for Robin's own development, also highlights Batman's deeper psychological issues, his inability to let go, his fear of losing control, and his reluctance to form emotional bonds. At the core of Batman's existence lies his deep-seated belief that the traditional criminal justice system in Gotham is fundamentally broken. Batman's moral code, while driven by a sense of justice, is also deeply tied to his psychological need for control over a world that he perceives as chaotic and uncontrollable. This need for control, combined with his trauma and his belief that the law is ineffective, leads him to reject the very system he could work within. Batman sees the police, the courts, and the politicians as compromised, ineffective, and often corrupt. Therefore, in his mind, he is the only one who can enforce true justice in Gotham. His moral code, which includes his refusal to kill, his need to fight crime on his own terms, and his personalized sense of justice, is not simply about upholding moral principles, it is a psychological necessity for him. Batman's refusal to cooperate with the criminal justice system is a product of his deep-seated distrust of its inefficiency and compromise, stemming from both his past experiences and his inherent fear of losing control. This disconnect with law enforcement becomes one of the central psychological elements that define Batman's entire mission in Gotham. Batman's relationship with law enforcement, specifically the Gotham City Police Department, GCPD, is one of cooperation and conflict. While he works with the police, he also works outside the law. This paradox shapes Batman's role in Gotham. While he is technically an ally of the GCPD, he often operates above and beyond the law, acting as a vigilante in ways that circumvent the established systems of justice. His refusal to fully trust the police, whom he often sees as ineffective or compromised by corruption, drives him to operate independently. Batman's relationship with Commissioner Gordon, who represents the last bastion of the law in Gotham, is critical to understanding this dynamic. Gordon, despite being an ally, represents everything Batman believes is wrong with Gotham's justice system. He works within the system, believing in the potential for reform. Batman, on the other hand, sees reform as a slow process that will never achieve the immediate results that Gotham needs. This psychological rift is a result of Batman's need for immediate justice and instant control, which the bureaucratic and regulated system of law enforcement cannot provide. Batman's rejection of due process and rule of law comes from a deep distrust of the system, a belief that it is inherently flawed and unable to act decisively in the face of Gotham's deep-seated corruption and crime. His refusal to work fully within the law is both a moral stance and a psychological defense mechanism, born from the trauma of his parents' death and his belief that the system failed them. For Batman, the system let him down, and as a result, he cannot trust it to bring real justice to Gotham. Batman's rejection of law enforcement and the legal system reflects his psychological need for control and his fear of vulnerability. If Batman were to fully integrate himself into Gotham's criminal justice system, he would be required to trust the institutional processes of law and allow others to take part in the decisions that govern Gotham's safety. This would mean giving up some of his power, and more importantly, it would force him to confront the vulnerability inherent in working as part of a team. Batman, however, operates on the belief that he alone can handle the moral responsibility of Gotham. His refusal to work with law enforcement fully reflects his psychological fear of failure. If he entrusts his work to others, there's a possibility that his own sense of control would slip, and Gotham could once again fall into the same state of chaos that claimed his parents' lives. Batman's need to maintain a centralized authority over Gotham's fate is not just about enforcing justice, but about maintaining his personal identity. If Batman were to submit to the rules of the law, he would lose the core of his mission, which is rooted in his psychological trauma and the belief that he must save Gotham by any means necessary, including bypassing the law itself. The psychological consequences of Batman's refusal to fully embrace the criminal justice system are significant. By continuing to work outside the law, Batman reinforces the culture of dependency that Gotham has come to rely on. Gotham citizens are conditioned to look for Batman's intervention, believing that only he can solve the city's problems. The GCPD, while initially supportive of Batman's work, begins to become dependent on him, allowing Batman to operate outside the constraints of the law without ever being fully held accountable for his actions. The police, in a sense, become complicit in Batman's vigilantism as they rely on him to do the work that they either cannot or will not do. This dependence on Batman's interventions creates a moral paradox. While Batman's actions may be effective in the short term, they prevent the systemic changes necessary for long-term social reform in Gotham. The police force, like Gotham's criminal justice system, becomes ineffective because of its reliance on Batman's vigilantism. The more Batman works outside the law, the more the system fails to evolve and address the underlying causes of crime and corruption. Batman's moral code keeps him isolated from the institutions that could potentially reform Gotham, trapping him in a cycle of reactionary justice rather than proactive change. Moreover, Batman's psychological need for control over the criminal justice system leads him to take actions that undermine the very goals he claims to uphold. His refusal to trust the legal system and his belief that it is too corrupt to function results in his attempts to substitute the system with his own individual sense of justice. However, Batman's moral absolutism leads to moral ambiguity. His actions, while aimed at protecting Gotham, are often marked by coercion, manipulation, and violence. The moral compromise inherent in Batman's methods mirrors the flaws in Gotham's criminal justice system, making his work an ongoing paradox. By operating outside the law, Batman refuses to engage with the system that could ultimately lead to structural reforms that address the root causes of Gotham's crime problem. Instead, Batman perpetuates a system where violence and vigilantism remain the primary means of justice, preventing Gotham from ever achieving a true social contract between its citizens and the legal system. The tension between Batman and the criminal justice system in Gotham highlights the psychological flaws that underpin his moral code. His need to act alone without collaboration comes from a deep fear of failure and loss of control. Batman believes that the system is broken because it failed him as a child, and this belief prevents him from trusting the mechanisms of the law. However, his unwillingness to fully integrate into the system leads to a moral paradox. While he seeks justice, his actions often perpetuate the very chaos he's trying to eliminate. The moral code he has developed to protect himself from his own pain has led him into a cycle of perpetual isolation, injustice, and failure, both in his personal relationships and in his mission to protect Gotham. At the core of Batman's moral code lies his unwavering commitment to never kill. This principle, while noble in its intent, creates a psychological paradox for Batman. He is fighting a battle that, despite his best efforts, never ends. His refusal to kill criminals is a reflection of his desire for moral purity, but it also serves as a psychological crutch that keeps him from addressing the root causes of Gotham's criminality. By adhering to this code, Batman believes that he is doing what is right, maintaining his moral superiority over the criminals he hunts. However, the more he adheres to his no-kill rule, the more he becomes entrenched in the cycle of violence that defines Gotham. Each time he captures a criminal, he lets them go, knowing they will return to commit more crimes. The Joker, perhaps the most dangerous of all Batman's enemies, embodies this cycle in its purest form. No matter how many times Batman captures him, the Joker always escapes, and the cycle continues. Batman's moral code, while intended to protect Gotham from becoming a lawless city, actually reinforces the very violence he seeks to eliminate. This paradoxical relationship between justice and violence is a reflection of Batman's psychological dilemma. By refusing to kill, Batman believes he is keeping his moral integrity intact. Yet, by constantly allowing criminals to escape justice and return to their criminal ways, he contributes to the ongoing violence in Gotham. Batman's moral code creates a situation where the very system he is trying to enforce cannot function effectively. He becomes caught in a loop where his refusal to cross the line leads him to compromise his own goals. Each time Batman lets a criminal go free, the city becomes more dependent on his intervention, and Gotham's criminal underworld grows stronger. The longer Batman fights this unwinnable battle, the more it becomes clear that his moral absolutism is not a source of strength, but rather a psychological barrier that keeps him from achieving real change in Gotham. Batman's refusal to kill also reflects his internal conflict, his deep fear of becoming the very thing he fights against. His trauma and guilt from the death of his parents have led him to believe that to kill is to lose one's humanity. However, this belief is flawed, as it fails to recognize that true justice requires more than simply stopping criminals. It requires a holistic approach to address the systemic causes of crime. Batman's insistence on his no-kill rule blinds him to the fact that his actions, while morally sound in his eyes, perpetuate the cycle of violence and suffering in Gotham. Instead of providing Gotham with a true path to healing, Batman's actions become a stopgap that prevents the city from ever evolving beyond its reliance on his vigilantism. Gotham's leaders, law enforcement, and citizens become psychologically conditioned to wait for Batman to solve their problems, rather than taking ownership of their own justice system. The more Batman fails to kill his enemies, the more stagnant Gotham becomes, unable to build the systems of justice that would free the city from the perpetual grip of crime and violence. This psychological toll is not just a matter of Gotham's social dysfunction, it also deeply impacts Batman himself. The emotional exhaustion that comes from constantly battling the city's crime, while refusing to cross the line between justice and brutality, begins to take its toll on him. The moral fatigue that Batman experiences is compounded by his sense of failure. Despite his relentless efforts, Gotham continues to descend deeper into chaos and crime. Each time he lets a criminal go free, he is confronted with the reality that his methods are not working. Batman's refusal to confront his own moral contradictions leads to a crisis of self-worth. The more he sacrifices himself for Gotham, the less he sees a way out of the cycle of violence he is caught in. This sense of personal failure feeds into a vicious cycle of psychological and emotional distress, where Batman cannot escape the reality that his moral code, rather than being a strength, is the very thing that prevents him from achieving his goal. In many ways, Batman's moral code can be seen as a reflection of his own psychological wounds. His obsession with maintaining moral purity is a direct result of his trauma and his fear of becoming a killer, just like the man who murdered his parents. For Batman, to kill would be to lose control and to succumb to the darkness that has haunted him since childhood. However, this belief leads to a psychological paradox. The more Batman insists on maintaining his moral code, the more he becomes entrenched in the violence he seeks to stop. The criminals he captures return, and the cycle begins again. This internal conflict mirrors Gotham's own social and institutional issues, where short-term solutions, Batman's interventions, create the illusion of progress, while failing to address the underlying problems that keep Gotham trapped in a state of constant crisis. Batman's moral absolutism serves as a psychological defense mechanism that keeps him from truly facing the deeper issues within himself and within Gotham. It is easier for him to focus on the immediate problem of crime and to enforce his own system of justice than to confront the systemic issues that underlie Gotham's social decay. Ultimately, Batman's refusal to kill and his insistence on adhering to his moral code create a psychological paradox that prevents him from truly resolving the cycle of violence in Gotham. Each time he intervenes, he reinforces the idea that Gotham cannot survive without him, that only Batman can bring justice to the city. This psychological dependency becomes deeply ingrained in the fabric of Gotham's social and criminal systems. Gotham's citizens and law enforcement are conditioned to believe that Batman is the solution, and as a result, the true solutions to the city's problems, those based on sustainable reform and institutional justice, are never allowed to take root. Batman's moral code, while a reflection of his personal values, ultimately becomes a barrier to the growth of Gotham's society. His refusal to kill, while seemingly a moral triumph, ultimately locks him and the city in a cycle of failure and psychological exhaustion that no amount of heroic intervention can overcome. At the heart of Batman's psychological isolation lies his refusal to confront his emotional pain and the trauma of losing his parents. His moral code, rigid in its no-kill rule and unwavering in its commitment to justice, serves as both a shield and a mask, a way to distance himself from the grief and rage that drive his every action. His refusal to kill is not just about maintaining a sense of moral purity, it is about his psychological need to keep control over his environment and his emotions. Batman's fear of vulnerability is so deep-rooted that he cannot allow himself to feel or process the pain of his parents' deaths. His moral framework, designed to protect others from the kind of suffering he endured, ultimately prevents him from addressing his own pain. He becomes so consumed by his mission that he sacrifices his emotional well-being in the process, never allowing himself the space or time to truly heal. The more Batman clings to his moral code, the more he locks himself into a cycle of repression, where his personal grief is never allowed to be acknowledged or resolved. The very moral code that Batman adheres to, while seeming noble, is a defense mechanism that keeps him from dealing with the emotional fallout of his parents' deaths. By refusing to kill, Batman maintains the illusion of control over his mission and his identity. Killing would mean losing control, and for Batman, losing control is equivalent to succumbing to the same chaos that took away his parents. This fear of chaos and his need to prevent emotional vulnerability keep him from ever truly releasing his grief or acknowledging that his need for justice is not just a moral mission, but a psychological one. Batman, in essence, uses his moral code as a way to prevent himself from confronting the painful truth that his obsession with justice is rooted in a deep emotional wound. Rather than face the trauma of loss, Batman channels all of his energy into his mission, creating a life that revolves around fighting crime rather than dealing with his own emotional scars. This emotional suppression leads to a profound psychological isolation, where Batman becomes more disconnected from his own humanity and increasingly reliant on his vigilante persona to mask his emotional turmoil. Batman's psychological isolation is further exacerbated by his refusal to allow others to help him. His moral code dictates that he must handle everything alone, that his vigilante mission is a solitary responsibility that no one else can share. This need for self-sufficiency is rooted in a fear of dependence, a belief that needing help would make him weak, vulnerable, or even unworthy of the mantle of Batman. He does not allow himself to rely on others because that would require him to acknowledge his own emotional needs, something he is unwilling to do. Batman keeps his allies, like Commissioner Gordon and Alfred, at arm's length, believing that if he opens up to them, he will lose his sense of control and his moral authority. This need for emotional distance prevents Batman from forming meaningful relationships, as he cannot allow himself to be seen as vulnerable or in need of support. Even when he desperately needs help, Batman chooses to shut people out, further isolating himself in the process. His refusal to let others into his emotional world perpetuates his psychological stagnation as he remains trapped in a cycle of self-reliance and emotional repression. This isolation, while seemingly self-imposed, has far-reaching consequences on Batman's psychological well-being. His refusal to confront his grief or seek support leaves him emotionally stunted. His inability to process his trauma prevents him from truly healing, and he becomes trapped in the illusion that his moral code is the only thing standing between him and becoming like the criminals he fights. This belief fuels his obsessive behavior and his constant need to reinforce his moral principles, even at the cost of his own mental and emotional health. Batman's fear of failure, the idea that he could become like the criminals he hunts, keeps him from ever truly experiencing personal growth or emotional release. The trauma of his parents' deaths has defined his identity for so long that he cannot imagine himself as anything other than Batman, a figure defined by moral purity and self-sacrifice. As a result, he pushes away any potential for personal healing, choosing instead to live in a state of constant emotional repression. The long-term effects of this emotional repression are profound. As Batman continues to operate under his moral code, his psychological toll grows heavier. His refusal to confront his past trauma leads him to a point of emotional exhaustion where the weight of his mission and moral absolutism becomes nearly unbearable. Batman becomes psychologically burned out, unable to find peace or relief from the grief and anger that fuel his crusade. His inability to connect with others or seek help leads to a sense of emotional burnout, where he can no longer separate his identity as Bruce Wayne from his identity as Batman. This psychological collapse forces Batman to constantly reassert his control, reinforcing his rigid moral framework even though it no longer serves his long-term well-being. His isolation becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, as the more he distances himself from others, the more trapped he becomes in the persona he has created to protect himself from the emotional pain that has defined his life. Batman's moral code becomes the ultimate mask that prevents him from addressing the real psychological issues he faces. It is no longer just a set of ethical rules, it is the psychological defense that keeps him from facing his deepest fears and unresolved grief. By refusing to confront his past, Batman condemns himself to a life of emotional paralysis, where his mission becomes a never-ending quest that distracts him from the reality of his own psychological needs. His obsession with justice becomes an emotional safeguard, preventing him from allowing himself to experience true healing and personal growth. In the end, Batman's refusal to confront his trauma and his psychological isolation are the very things that keep him locked in a cycle of failure, both as a hero and as a person. Batman's entire mission revolves around the belief that he can bring order and justice to Gotham, a city plagued by crime and corruption. At the center of his moral code is the strict refusal to kill, a principle that defines how he approaches every criminal encounter. For Batman, killing is the ultimate line that, if crossed, would destroy his humanity and turn him into the very kind of criminal he is trying to stop. This belief is deeply rooted in his psychological trauma. The death of his parents left him with a profound fear of losing control and succumbing to violence. To kill, in Batman's mind, would be to give in to that fear, to become the very monster he has sworn to destroy. As such, his non-lethal approach has become the cornerstone of his identity as both Bruce Wayne and Batman. However, the paradox at the heart of Batman's moral code is that by refusing to kill, he fails to address the systemic nature of Gotham's crime. The criminals Batman faces Whether it's the Joker, Two-Face, or Penguin, are not simply isolated threats that can be solved through a momentary intervention. These figures are symptoms of a much deeper systemic problem: the corruption within Gotham's institutions, the failure of its justice system, and the decay of its social fabric. By choosing to fight individual criminals while refusing to take drastic action, Batman perpetuates the cycle. He might stop a bank robbery one day, but the next, another criminal will rise, emboldened by the fact that Gotham's justice system will never truly hold them accountable. Batman's refusal to kill creates an endless loop, where he continues to fight the symptoms of Gotham's problems but never addresses the root causes. His interventions, while necessary in the short term, become reactive rather than proactive, and Gotham becomes caught in a cycle of violence that Batman himself cannot escape. Batman's moral absolutism further exacerbates this problem. By adhering strictly to his rule of non-lethality, he remains the only viable source of action. But the power imbalance it creates results in a system of dependence that prevents Gotham from healing. Batman, in his pursuit of moral purity, refuses to accept the reality that his methods, no matter how effective they may seem, are inherently flawed and ultimately counterproductive. He becomes locked in a psychological cycle where his mission to fight crime is constantly renewed by the very criminals he seeks to stop. Each time Batman stops a criminal, he creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is soon filled by someone equally capable of causing havoc. This cycle of violence becomes a self-sustaining system in which Batman is not merely the protector of Gotham, but also the symptom of its failure to move beyond a constant state of crisis. The moral paradox here is that Batman's refusal to take drastic action keeps him entrenched in the very chaos he seeks to stop, preventing Gotham from ever achieving true reform. This contradiction also has psychological ramifications for Batman. His refusal to kill, while intended to preserve his humanity, only reinforces his sense of moral superiority. Batman believes that he is the only one capable of bringing justice to Gotham, but in doing so, he isolates himself from others and alienates potential allies. His obsession with his code prevents him from acknowledging the shortcomings of his approach. Batman's view of justice is absolutist. He believes in a black and white system where right and wrong are clearly defined. However, the complexity of Gotham's criminal landscape is much more nuanced than his moral framework allows. The Joker, for instance, represents the ultimate moral challenge to Batman's sense of justice. The Joker's chaos cannot be contained within Batman's moral code, as the Joker operates outside of all forms of reason and logic. Batman's inability to kill the Joker, despite the extreme violence and suffering the villain inflicts on Gotham, reveals the limits of his moral system. Batman's inability to compromise on his code leads to psychological exhaustion and a sense of futility, as the Joker's escape is inevitable and the cycle of violence continues unabated. Batman's refusal to kill also has deep emotional consequences for him. As he continually faces off against the same villains who return time and again after each capture, he begins to question the effectiveness of his methods. His belief that justice can only be achieved through his moral absolutism gradually begins to conflict with the realities of Gotham's situation. This emotional toll is compounded by the fact that Batman's moral framework leaves him no room for personal growth or healing. His refusal to kill keeps him emotionally locked in a perpetual state of grief and guilt over the loss of his parents. He cannot move forward because his moral code keeps him focused on the past, the moment of trauma that defined his mission. His obsession with justice prevents him from addressing his personal wounds, and this emotional stagnation feeds into his ongoing psychological distress. The more Batman adheres to his moral code, the more he is driven by his trauma, leading to an unhealthy obsession with crime fighting that prevents him from ever fully confronting the pain that has defined his life. Moreover, Batman's refusal to kill criminals also prevents him from forming meaningful relationships with those around him. His moral absolutism keeps him from letting anyone close enough to understand the real Bruce Wayne. He isolates himself emotionally, believing that by maintaining control over his moral actions, he can protect others from the chaos of his inner world. Yet this very isolation only reinforces his psychological distress as he becomes more trapped in his vigilante identity, unable to express his true emotions or work collaboratively with others. His constant need to prove that he is above reproach, morally speaking, prevents him from engaging with others in an emotionally authentic way, which further isolates him from potential allies. Even those closest to him, such as Alfred and Robin, are forced to contend with Batman's refusal to compromise, which ultimately pushes them away. Robin's departure, as a result of Batman's inability to adapt his moral approach, underscores the emotional consequences of Batman's psychological rigidity. Batman's insistence on staying true to his principles alienates those who might help him heal, ultimately making him more lonely and disconnected from the world he strives to protect. Batman's moral code, while rooted in a desire to protect Gotham and uphold a personal sense of justice, ultimately exacerbates the institutional failures that plague the city. By working outside of the established criminal justice system, Batman undermines the efforts of law enforcement, judges, and other officials who are tasked with maintaining order in Gotham. His refusal to engage fully with these systems of justice means that Gotham's leaders are never held accountable for their role in perpetuating the city's systemic corruption. Instead, Batman's moral absolutism becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, where he is the only authority figure capable of restoring order. But his continued reliance on vigilantism means that the criminal justice system never truly evolves to address the root causes of Gotham's instability. The more Batman isolates himself from traditional law enforcement, the more dependent Gotham becomes on his intervention. The Gotham City Police Department, GCPD, while initially willing to work alongside Batman, eventually becomes reliant on his vigilante justice. The police begin to view Batman as an extension of their own authority, allowing him to bypass the checks and balances that are necessary for a fair and transparent legal system. Gotham citizens, meanwhile, are conditioned to look to Batman for protection, rather than demanding the reforms needed to make Gotham's criminal justice system more effective and accountable. This dynamic creates a psychological dependency on Batman, where Gotham's people come to believe that only Batman can keep them safe, and they are unwilling to address the broader systemic issues that allow crime and corruption to flourish. Batman's refusal to cooperate fully with the law prevents him from seeing the broader consequences of his actions. The moral absolutism that defines his character prevents him from acknowledging the limitations of his own approach. While Batman's methods may provide short-term solutions, they are inherently flawed and fail to address the underlying causes of Gotham's crime and corruption. By acting as judge, jury, and executioner, Batman not only bypasses the legal processes that should be in place, but he also reinforces the idea that justice is personal, that the law is inadequate, and that only an individual with superior morals like Batman can truly enforce justice. This belief in moral absolutism ultimately alienates Gotham's institutions, preventing the city from developing a justice system that is fair, accountable, and capable of achieving long-term reform. By refusing to kill, Batman believes he is upholding a moral high ground, but his actions lead to a moral paradox. While Batman's refusal to kill may align with his own sense of personal justice, it perpetuates a system where criminals are constantly released to commit further crimes. The Joker, for example, is an iconic representation of this paradox. Every time Batman captures him, the Joker escapes and continues to wreak havoc, knowing that Batman's non-lethal code prevents him from ending the cycle. Batman's inability to take final action against such criminals not only fails to stop the violence, but it reinforces the instability of Gotham's justice system. The psychological toll of this paradox is significant. Batman is unable to separate his moral code from the practical realities of Gotham's need for decisive justice. His insistence on moral purity is ultimately unsustainable, and as Gotham's crime rate continues to rise, Batman is forced to confront the reality that his approach to justice is not working. Furthermore, Batman's failure to work within Gotham's legal system and his refusal to collaborate with the city's leadership exacerbates the institutional dysfunction that defines Gotham's justice system. Gotham's politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, while they may recognize the need for reform, are often complicit in the status quo. Batman's isolation from these institutions makes it difficult for meaningful reform to take place. By acting as a lone vigilante, Batman essentially invalidates the role of the city's legal system, allowing it to remain weak and corrupt. Gotham's leaders are never truly held accountable for their failure to address the systemic issues of corruption, poverty, and crime. Batman's refusal to engage with Gotham's institutions leaves the city in a state of moral ambiguity, where justice is defined by individual action rather than collective responsibility. The psychological impact of this situation on Batman is profound. His moral code, while providing him with a sense of personal control, also limits his ability to form relationships with those who could help him in his mission. His refusal to collaborate with law enforcement keeps him emotionally isolated and prevents him from empowering others to take on the responsibility of justice. This isolation, which is a direct result of his fear of vulnerability and his moral absolutism, also has long-term consequences for his own psychological well-being. Batman becomes trapped in a cycle where he believes that only he can save Gotham, but this belief forces him to continuously sacrifice himself for the city at the cost of his own mental health and personal relationships. His sense of responsibility and his moral code become the very things that prevent him from healing from his trauma and growing beyond his role as Batman. Batman's moral code and psychological isolation prevent him from seeing that Gotham's problems are systemic. They are not just about criminals being stopped, but about reforming the institutions that allow crime to persist. His refusal to collaborate with the legal system and his insistence on working alone not only stifle personal growth, but also prevent Gotham from moving beyond its reliance on Batman. The city's moral and social decay is not addressed because Batman's vigilantism provides the illusion of justice without addressing the fundamental flaws in the system. Gotham remains in a constant state of emergency, unable to address the underlying issues that perpetuate its problems. Batman's refusal to evolve psychologically is intricately tied to his moral code, which is a direct result of the trauma he endured as a child. The murder of his parents, witnessed at a young age, left an indelible mark on Bruce Wayne's psyche, shaping not only his sense of justice, but his approach to life. Batman's moral framework, particularly his refusal to kill, was established as a reaction to his trauma, a means to protect himself from the emotional vulnerability that would arise if he allowed himself to grieve. His non-lethal stance represents his need to control the chaos around him and, more importantly, to avoid confronting his own emotions. The fear of crossing the line into violence stems from his deep-seated belief that succumbing to that darkness would mean losing his identity as a protector and becoming like the criminals he seeks to defeat. This moral absolutism becomes a psychological defense mechanism, keeping Batman from dealing with the emotional pain that has defined his life. In the aftermath of the tragedy that killed his parents, Batman made a psychological choice to suppress his grief and channel it into action. His mission, driven by his moral code, became an escape from his unresolved emotions. Rather than allow himself to process the deep grief, rage, and guilt associated with his parents' deaths, Batman chose to lock away those emotions and instead focused on delivering justice to Gotham. This decision, though admirable in its intention, prevented Batman from growing emotionally. The moral code that Batman clings to is not just a reflection of his belief in justice. It is a psychological crutch that shields him from facing the reality of his own vulnerabilities. His refusal to kill and his insistence on operating within a very narrow moral framework become the walls that keep him emotionally trapped. He cannot allow himself to experience emotions fully, nor can he confront the emptiness that comes from living a life defined by an uncompromising sense of justice. This emotional repression not only prevents Batman from healing, but also blocks his psychological growth. He is stuck in a perpetual state of reaction, unable to move forward and address the underlying emotional wounds that continue to fester beneath the surface. Moreover, Batman's refusal to evolve is reinforced by his need to maintain a sense of control. Batman's moral code is about maintaining order in Gotham, but it is also about maintaining control over his own emotional world. By adhering to the strict rules he has set for himself, particularly the refusal to kill, Batman avoids the fear that comes with letting go and allowing others to help. This need for self-sufficiency is a direct result of his psychological trauma and his fear of being vulnerable. Batman believes that vulnerability is a weakness and that to let others in would be to lose control of his mission. The more Batman distances himself from others, the more trapped he becomes in the very emotional isolation he has created. His refusal to form meaningful relationships, both with allies like Alfred and Robin, and with others in Gotham, stems from this fear of being emotionally exposed. Batman's inability to trust others emotionally keeps him in a perpetual state of self-reliance, but this self-reliance is ultimately detrimental to his well-being. By cutting himself off from the very people who care about him, Batman perpetuates his emotional paralysis. This emotional stagnation is not just a personal issue. It is psychologically debilitating and begins to affect Batman's role as a hero. The more Batman clings to his moral code and operates as a solitary figure, the more his psychological exhaustion grows. His refusal to adapt and reevaluate his approach to crime fighting creates a sense of futility that begins to weigh on him. Batman's uncompromising nature makes it difficult for him to see the long-term effects of his actions. Each time he captures a criminal and lets them go, he feels the weight of his moral purity, but it also becomes a reminder that his approach is not working. The sense of failure grows more pronounced as Gotham continues to slide deeper into chaos. Batman becomes aware, albeit subconsciously, that his refusal to kill is not solving the city's problems, it is perpetuating the cycle of violence. But because of his psychological need for control and his fear of vulnerability, Batman refuses to admit this failure, choosing instead to continue down the same path that has kept him emotionally stagnant. The psychological toll of Batman's emotional isolation is also reflected in his relationships with his allies. Batman's moral code, combined with his refusal to open up emotionally, keeps his relationships with Alfred and Robin distant and often strained. Alfred, despite his unwavering loyalty, is often relegated to the role of caretaker rather than a true emotional confidant. Alfred understands the deep emotional pain Batman is in, but he is largely powerless to help Batman face it because of the emotional walls that Batman has built. The disconnection between them is palpable. Alfred cares deeply for Bruce, but Bruce keeps him at a distance, refusing to trust anyone with the full scope of his emotional pain. The same is true of Robin. While Batman may see him as an ally and partner in his crusade against crime, the inability to emotionally connect with Robin creates tension. Robin, particularly as he matures, begins to see the limitations of Batman's moral code and psychological state. Eventually, this leads to a breakdown in their relationship as Robin seeks a more balanced approach to justice, one that recognizes the complexities of Gotham's problems rather than relying on Batman's rigid absolutism. Robin's departure is a direct result of Batman's emotional repression and his failure to connect emotionally with his allies, creating a fractured partnership that could have been one of Batman's greatest sources of strength. Batman's relationship with Gotham is perhaps the most complex and revealing aspect of his entire persona. On one hand, Batman is driven by a deep love for the city, seeking to protect it from the corruption and crime that have long plagued it. His mission, however, is a paradox. Batman's desire to save Gotham is rooted in his belief that it is irredeemably broken. In Batman's mind, the city cannot save itself. It needs a vigilante who can impose order in a way that the traditional systems of justice cannot. This belief is grounded in his own trauma and the failure of Gotham's legal system to protect his parents. Batman's moral code, particularly his refusal to kill, is an attempt to create a boundary between himself and the chaos of the criminals he fights, while also maintaining a sense of moral superiority. He believes that as long as he upholds his moral integrity, he is not part of the problem, even as his methods inadvertently become part of the solution's problem. Batman's refusal to kill reflects a psychological defense mechanism that not only allows him to stay true to his personal values, but also keeps him from confronting the real underlying issues within Gotham. His no-kill rule becomes a way for Batman to keep control over his moral identity, but it also creates a self-imposed limit to the kind of radical solutions that Gotham needs. His reluctance to allow others to kill in the name of justice, their belief in the use of lethal force to end the cycle of violence, stems from his psychological trauma. He is afraid that if he crosses the line, if he kills even one person, he will lose the moral high ground and become just as corrupt as those he fights. This moral absolutism, while keeping Batman's moral identity intact, perpetuates Gotham's dysfunction. By adhering to his moral code, Batman prevents Gotham from developing the institutional solutions necessary to stop the crime problem for good. The city, unable to rely on its own legal institutions, instead relies on Batman to act as the final arbiter of justice, which creates a cycle of dependency that keeps Gotham in a state of perpetual crisis. Batman's continued intervention in Gotham's justice system also undermines the efforts of law enforcement and political leaders to establish more sustainable and reform-based solutions. As long as Batman is present, Gotham's police and city officials are never forced to truly reform the systems that allow crime to flourish. Batman's vigilantism reinforces the belief that Gotham needs an external force, rather than its own law enforcement and social systems, to enforce justice. His role as a lone vigilante undermines Gotham's potential for structural reform. The city's leaders, rather than making difficult decisions to tackle the root causes of its crime problem, can lean on Batman to solve their problems for them. This creates an emotional and institutional dependence on Batman, which prevents Gotham from evolving and building internal mechanisms of justice and social stability. Batman's refusal to embrace the system leads to an ongoing disconnect between the people and the institutions that are supposed to protect them. As the years pass, this moral stagnation becomes more pronounced. Batman, still believing in the efficacy of his moral code, continues to fight the same battles against the same villains, even as the city becomes more dependent on him. This cycle of violence and dependency keeps Gotham in a state of perpetual turmoil, where the citizens are never able to take responsibility for their city's problems. Gotham's inability to solve its own issues is directly tied to Batman's refusal to allow real reform. His obsession with control and his belief that only he can protect the city keep Gotham in a state of psychological paralysis. The more Batman acts as the hero Gotham needs, the more Gotham becomes trapped in the belief that only a vigilante can save it from itself. This belief becomes deeply ingrained in the psychology of the city, leading to a self-perpetuating cycle of violence where Gotham never breaks free from the need for Batman's intervention. Batman's moral absolutism also affects his psychological state, further contributing to the cycle of violence in Gotham. By constantly trying to maintain his moral purity, Batman becomes increasingly isolated. His refusal to compromise on his code, whether it's his unwillingness to kill or his insistence on taking on all the responsibility for Gotham's safety, prevents him from building meaningful relationships with his allies and with the people he's trying to protect. Batman's emotional isolation makes it difficult for him to form trusting partnerships, either with Gordon, who still relies on him despite Batman's continual undermining of the justice system, or with Robin, who eventually grows frustrated with the lack of progress in Gotham. Batman's inability to trust others and his refusal to delegate responsibility creates a psychological distance between him and those who care about him. This isolation becomes a key psychological barrier to Batman's personal growth and prevents him from seeing how his moral rigidity may be a form of self-punishment, keeping him trapped in a state of emotional stagnation. The more Batman tries to save Gotham by adhering to his moral code, the more he becomes a part of the problem, unable to break free from the very cycle of crime he seeks to eliminate. Batman's relationship with power is deeply shaped by his psychological need for control. His trauma, which stems from the loss of his parents, led to a profound fear of helplessness and loss of agency. The event that shaped Bruce Wayne into Batman was the inability of the law to protect his parents. In the aftermath of that tragedy, Bruce vowed to never again feel powerless. To ensure that he could maintain control over his world, Batman adopted a moral code that allowed him to impose his own form of justice in Gotham. His refusal to kill and his insistence on acting outside the law were driven by a need to reassert control over the chaotic forces that shaped his past. In essence, Batman took on the role of judge, jury, and executioner, choosing to act outside the bounds of the justice system that he felt had failed him. However, this choice, while it gave Batman a sense of power and agency, also contributed to a psychological paradox. In trying to control Gotham's chaos, Batman undermined the very systems that could have created a more balanced and effective form of justice. His insistence on doing things his way kept Gotham's institutions from growing, leaving them weak and ineffective. Batman's psychological need for dominance often manifests in his interactions with Gotham's leadership. Whether it's Commissioner Gordon, the mayor, or other law enforcement officials, Batman tends to operate outside their authority, positioning himself as the ultimate enforcer of justice. While he collaborates with Gordon, their relationship is often strained by Batman's reluctance to adhere to the established legal system. Gordon, despite his respect for Batman, is often left frustrated by the fact that Batman's approach to justice is not just outside the law, but above the law. Batman, in his quest for moral purity, refuses to allow anyone else to take the lead. He sees collaboration as a form of compromise, fearing that it would dilute his sense of moral superiority. This constant need to operate alone prevents Gotham from building functional institutions that can address the city's long-term needs. Batman's reluctance to work within the system undermines the power of the system itself. He becomes the central authority, and by reinforcing this power dynamic, he makes it impossible for Gotham to build a sustainable justice system. Gotham, rather than growing into a self-reliant city, becomes dependent on Batman's presence, further deepening the cycle of reliance. Batman's autocratic tendencies are also visible in his relationship with his allies. Batman's moral code often dictates how his allies must operate. His refusal to kill criminals and his belief in the moral high ground prevent his sidekicks, particularly Robin, from forging their own moral paths. Batman's insistence on moral purity leads to a power imbalance in his relationship with Robin, who, as he matures, begins to question Batman's approach. Robin's eventual departure from Batman is a direct result of this power dynamic. As Batman's moral absolutism becomes more entrenched, Robin finds it impossible to work within the rigid framework that Batman has set. This leads to a psychological breakdown in their relationship. Batman's inability to share power or trust his allies with decision-making keeps him emotionally isolated, unable to build partnerships with those who could help him in his mission. His autocratic approach to justice prevents him from creating a more collaborative and effective model of crime fighting in Gotham. The more he isolates himself, the more he becomes dependent on his own sense of moral authority, reinforcing the very isolation that keeps him emotionally trapped. This psychological need for control also affects Batman's relationship with the criminal underworld. By choosing to fight criminals on his own terms, Batman often exacerbates the problem rather than solving it. Criminals in Gotham, particularly those like the Joker or Two-Face, become increasingly adept at exploiting Batman's refusal to compromise. Batman's moral absolutism, particularly his refusal to kill, creates a power vacuum that villains are able to exploit. The Joker, for instance, thrives on chaos and sees Batman's moral code as a weakness to be exploited. By constantly capturing and releasing the same villains, Batman reinforces the idea that Gotham's justice system is ineffective and unable to truly solve crime. This failure to make definitive decisions and bring closure to Gotham's criminal problems perpetuates the cycle of violence, as criminals are emboldened by the knowledge that Batman cannot kill them. Batman's moral code thus becomes part of the system that allows Gotham's crime to continue, further entrenching the criminal underworld in a cycle of power dynamics with Batman at the center. Gotham becomes trapped in a cycle where Batman, rather than offering long-term solutions, keeps the city in a perpetual state of crisis, feeding the psychological dependence on his intervention. Batman's need for dominance also leads to a moral paradox that affects the citizens of Gotham. Gotham's people, while initially grateful for Batman's efforts, become increasingly reliant on him for protection. This creates a power dynamic where the citizens of Gotham no longer feel empowered to take responsibility for their own safety and well-being. Batman's actions reinforce the idea that Gotham is incapable of self-governance. His refusal to allow others to take the lead in reforming the city's systems of justice or social order leaves Gotham in a constant state of dependence. The more Batman fights, the more the cycle of violence and criminality deepens. Gotham's citizens become dependent on Batman as a symbol of protection, rather than demanding institutional change that would lead to long-term solutions. Batman's moral absolutism ensures that he remains the central figure of authority, but it also means that Gotham never develops its own systems of justice that are capable of self-regulation. This power dynamic keeps Gotham in a state of moral and institutional stagnation, as citizens and officials continue to wait for Batman to intervene, rather than working to reform the systems that allow crime to thrive. At the heart of Batman's identity lies a fundamental psychological paradox. He is both Bruce Wayne, the public figure, and Batman, the vigilante hero. On the surface, these two personas seem to serve distinct purposes. Bruce Wayne represents the persona of the wealthy philanthropist who uses his fortune and influence to help Gotham through legitimate means, while Batman is the embodiment of justice, fighting crime through unconventional and often violent methods. However, these two identities are not just separate, they are in constant conflict. The psychological toll of maintaining this duality is immense, as Batman must compartmentalize his emotions and actions in order to protect his identity as both a public figure and a secret vigilante. Batman's moral code, particularly his refusal to kill, complicates his relationship with his dual identity. On the one hand, Bruce Wayne represents the public face of justice, using his wealth to fund philanthropic efforts and improve the lives of Gotham's citizens. However, Bruce Wayne's public life is inherently disconnected from the reality of the violent justice Batman dispenses. As Batman, Bruce's commitment to his moral code drives him to enforce justice in ways that often involve physical confrontations, torture, and coercion, actions that stand in stark contrast to the idealized image of Bruce Wayne as a benevolent philanthropist. This psychological conflict is particularly pronounced when Bruce is forced to confront the moral implications of his actions as Batman. His refusal to kill reflects an attempt to maintain moral superiority in the face of Gotham's crime, but it also causes Batman to become increasingly alienated from his personal life as Bruce Wayne. His strict moral code creates a psychological divide between the two identities, forcing Bruce to keep his emotional world compartmentalized in ways that prevent him from ever truly processing his trauma or healing from the loss of his parents. The psychological fragmentation caused by this dual identity leads to a sense of emotional exhaustion. Batman, constantly operating under the strain of his moral code and the psychological demands of fighting crime, begins to lose touch with his true self. The trauma of witnessing his parents' deaths has defined Bruce Wayne's entire life, and it is through his identity as Batman that he seeks to atone for this loss. However, the more Bruce Wayne tries to live as both a philanthropist and a vigilante, the more he becomes psychologically overwhelmed. He has no outlet for his emotions and cannot separate his trauma from his quest for justice. This emotional disconnection makes it difficult for Bruce to form meaningful relationships, as he is unable to truly trust anyone with the emotional burden he carries. His dual identity keeps him isolated from others, and his inability to reconcile his two personas prevents him from leading a fulfilled life. The constant strain of living a double life forces Batman to become more emotionally repressed, as he is unable to reconcile his moral code with the personal cost it takes on him. The emotional toll of Batman's self-sacrifice and his moral absolutism manifests in a psychological disconnect between Bruce Wayne's identity as a public figure and Batman's identity as a vigilante hero. Batman's refusal to kill, combined with his commitment to constantly fight crime, forces him to make personal sacrifices that further separate him from any semblance of normalcy. His fear of vulnerability and his inability to acknowledge his humanity lead him to avoid personal connections and emotional intimacy. His refusal to let anyone in emotionally, whether it's Alfred, Commissioner Gordon, or Robin, stems from a fear of being exposed. He believes that if anyone truly understands who he is and what he has become, they will see him as a failure or as someone who is emotionally broken. This fear of rejection prevents Bruce from seeking help or support, and instead, he isolates himself emotionally, choosing to face his battles alone. The more Batman works to protect Gotham, the more he becomes estranged from his own humanity, unable to experience true emotional connection. This emotional distance also prevents Bruce from allowing himself to live a full life, as he continues to define his existence through the lens of his trauma and his moral mission. The psychological isolation that results from Batman's moral code also impacts his relationships with those who are closest to him. Alfred, his surrogate father and emotional anchor, understands the deep emotional pain that Batman carries, but he is largely powerless to help Bruce heal. Alfred's love and support are often met with resistance from Bruce, who refuses to confront his past trauma or open up emotionally. This emotional distance creates a dynamic where Alfred plays the role of a caretaker, providing practical support but unable to truly connect with Bruce on a deeper emotional level. Alfred's attempts to encourage Bruce to open up about his emotions are constantly rebuffed, as Bruce remains committed to his vigilante mission and the moral code that defines him. The more Batman isolates himself, the more he sacrifices his chance at personal growth and emotional healing, choosing to remain locked in his role as a vigilante rather than confronting the human side of his identity. The psychological divide between Bruce Wayne and Batman also prevents Bruce from embracing his true potential as a person. His fear of losing control over his identity keeps him from exploring his own humanity and experiencing life fully. His moral code, which is rooted in his trauma, defines his entire existence, but it also keeps him from living in the present moment. The emotional repression that Batman experiences prevents him from ever fully recovering from the pain of his past. His refusal to let go of his grief and his need to control the chaos around him means that he will never truly heal emotionally. Instead, Batman remains locked in a cycle of self-sacrifice, where his identity as a hero comes at the cost of his own emotional well-being. At the heart of Batman's psychological struggles lies a fundamental paradox. While he operates under the belief that he is saving Gotham, his very actions ensure that the city can never truly save itself. By adhering to his moral code, which forbids him from killing criminals and forces him to work outside the law, Batman reinforces the belief that Gotham needs vigilantism rather than a structured, accountable justice system. This creates a cycle of dependence that not only leaves Gotham's institutions weak and ineffective, but also creates an emotional and psychological barrier to institutional reform. Gotham's reliance on Batman means that the city's leaders, law enforcement, and citizens never fully take ownership of their own future or work to create long-term solutions to crime and corruption. Batman, in his quest for moral purity, has inadvertently stunted Gotham's growth and prevented the city from evolving beyond its dependence on him. Batman's legacy is defined by his self-sacrifice and uncompromising commitment to his moral code. But these very characteristics also limit his ability to influence Gotham in a way that leads to lasting change. By refusing to kill criminals and focusing solely on individual action, Batman avoids addressing the systemic issues that contribute to Gotham's crime. His methods, while noble in their intention, are ultimately reactive, not proactive, and create the illusion that Gotham's problems can be solved through heroic intervention rather than institutional reform. The more Batman fights, the more he perpetuates the cycle of violence and chaos, reinforcing the idea that only vigilantism can bring justice. This cycle of dependence on Batman leaves Gotham's politicians, police, and citizens in a state of passivity, waiting for Batman to take action instead of working together to create a sustainable solution to the city's issues. Batman's psychological isolation exacerbates this problem. His refusal to connect emotionally with others, whether it's Alfred, Gordon, or Robin, prevents him from forming the kind of collaborative relationships that are necessary for true reform. Instead of empowering others to take on the responsibility of maintaining justice in Gotham, Batman insists on doing everything himself, reinforcing the belief that only he can bring order to the city. This self-imposed isolation prevents him from mentoring others in a way that might help create a new generation of heroes or leaders who can carry the mantle of justice in Gotham. Batman's inability to share power or work with others limits his impact, as he cannot create a system where justice is not dependent on a single person. Instead, Gotham remains locked in a cycle of vigilance, where Batman is the only one who can fight the city's endless crime, but his absence would leave the city vulnerable to the very forces of chaos that he strives to eliminate. In many ways, Batman's legacy is defined by failure. Despite his best efforts, he is unable to create lasting change in Gotham, and his moral code, while admirable, locks him into a cycle of frustration and psychological exhaustion. Batman cannot accept the reality that his moral absolutism is preventing him from achieving his true goal, restoring order to Gotham. His refusal to compromise on his principles keeps him from reforming the system that allowed crime to thrive in the first place. Rather than pushing for long-term solutions that address the root causes of Gotham's crime, Batman's focus on immediate action ensures that Gotham remains in crisis. His legacy becomes one of perpetual vigilance, where the city never truly heals and continues to rely on Batman to solve its problems. In this way, Batman's moral code, while it grants him a sense of personal control, ultimately prevents him from making a meaningful difference in Gotham's future. The psychological consequences of Batman's legacy are also reflected in his relationship with Gotham's citizens. While Batman is seen as a symbol of hope, his vigilantism creates a psychological dependency in the city. The Gotham's people, rather than demanding reform from their leaders, are conditioned to look to Batman as their protector. This belief in Batman as the savior of Gotham reinforces the idea that the city cannot function without him. It is this dependence on Batman that prevents Gotham from developing its own systems of justice that are self-sustaining. The Gotham citizens come to believe that only Batman can save them, and in doing so, they abdicate responsibility for their own city. This psychological reliance on Batman's presence ensures that Gotham remains trapped in the same cycle of crime and injustice. Batman's legacy becomes a symbol of hope, but also a reminder that Gotham is unable to solve its own problems. The more Gotham depends on Batman, the more the city becomes psychologically dependent on a figure who is, at his core, morally conflicted and psychologically isolated. Batman's moral code is not just a personal set of beliefs, it is the foundation of his identity and, consequently, the symbol he represents to the people of Gotham. Batman operates on the belief that his no-kill rule and his uncompromising approach to justice make him a model of moral purity in a city riddled with corruption and crime. However, this very moral absolutism, while noble in intent, becomes problematic when viewed through the lens of psychological dependence and moral ambiguity. Gotham's citizens, many of whom live in fear of the criminal elements in the city, come to rely on Batman not only for protection but also as a moral figure who provides a sense of order in a chaotic world. This reliance on Batman, however, has profound psychological consequences for both the people of Gotham and Batman himself. From the perspective of the citizens of Gotham, Batman is a symbol of hope, someone who represents a justice that the government and the police have failed to provide. However, this hope is often short-lived. Batman's refusal to kill and his constant decision to engage in vigilante justice without accountability creates a distorted view of justice. To Gotham's citizens, Batman is the law, but a law that operates outside of any established system of due process or accountability. By making himself the sole arbiter of justice, Batman creates a city that is psychologically dependent on his presence. Gotham begins to rely on Batman for all forms of justice, believing that only his moral code can provide the order the city desperately needs. This dependency reinforces Gotham's social dysfunction. Citizens are no longer motivated to empower the legal system or push for reform. Instead, they wait for Batman to act, regardless of the consequences. The psychological toll of this dependence is significant. Gotham's residents come to see Batman as the ultimate solution to their problems, but this false sense of security leads to a long-term disempowerment of the population. By continuously relying on Batman, Gotham's people fail to take responsibility for their own future. They become psychologically conditioned to believe that only Batman can provide the justice they crave. The city's institutions, from the police force to the court system, remain stagnant as citizens place all their faith in a vigilante hero who operates outside the law. This lack of accountability perpetuates Gotham's cycle of violence, where justice is always seen as something to be administered by an individual rather than a society working together. Batman's psychological isolation plays a critical role in this dynamic. His fear of vulnerability and his refusal to connect emotionally with others lead him to embrace a role of moral superiority that alienates him from the very people he seeks to protect. Gotham's residents, while grateful for Batman's efforts, often view him as a distant and unapproachable figure, someone who works in the shadows but does not engage with the city's people in any meaningful way. This emotional distance between Batman and the citizens of Gotham further reinforces the power dynamic, where the people rely on Batman's decisions without ever questioning or challenging the morality behind his methods. The psychological toll on Gotham is profound. Citizens begin to see Batman's actions as the final word on justice, and the law becomes increasingly irrelevant in comparison to the vigilante justice that Batman administers. This dynamic is reflected in Batman's inability to connect emotionally with the people of Gotham, particularly those he works closest with, such as Alfred and Commissioner Gordon. While both men are deeply committed to Batman's mission, they also recognize the emotional cost of Batman's work. Alfred, for example, is well aware of the psychological toll that Batman's moral code has on Bruce Wayne's mental health. However, Alfred is often relegated to the role of a caretaker, someone who provides practical support but is unable to truly connect emotionally with Bruce. Similarly, Gordon, while a strong ally, is often left in a position where he must balance his own moral beliefs with his dependence on Batman. The tension between their personal values and their collaborative work is rooted in Batman's refusal to compromise on his moral absolutism. This psychological isolation further erodes Gotham's ability to function as a unified society, as it becomes increasingly dependent on Batman's actions instead of fostering a more collaborative approach to justice. This emotional distance is perhaps most evident in Batman's relationship with Robin, his most important ally. Robin, as an eager and capable crime fighter, is often frustrated by Batman's moral absolutism, which limits Robin's ability to make decisions on his own and forces him to operate under Batman's rigid framework. As Robin matures, he begins to see that Batman's unwillingness to compromise on his moral code is preventing Gotham from achieving lasting reform. The psychological tension between Batman's desire for control and Robin's desire for a more balanced approach to justice eventually leads to Robin's departure from Batman's side. Robin's exit symbolizes the psychological cost of Batman's emotional isolation and the consequences of his moral rigidity. By refusing to adapt or allow others to influence his decisions, Batman ensures that his relationships with others will always be tainted by the distance he places between himself and the world around him. This psychological vulnerability within Batman's relationship with the people of Gotham is a reflection of his inability to fully heal from the trauma of his childhood. The moral code he has developed is an emotional shield, protecting him from confronting the raw emotions that stem from the death of his parents. However, this shield, while offering him a sense of control, also prevents him from ever truly moving on. Batman's refusal to allow personal growth keeps him emotionally stunted, and this stagnation, while preserving his vigilante identity, ultimately hinders his ability to connect with others. This emotional distance becomes a barrier to Batman's personal development and perpetuates Gotham's cycle of dependence on a figure who is ultimately unapproachable and isolated from the very people he is trying to protect. As a mentor, Batman's influence on Gotham's next generation of heroes is both transformative and restrictive. On one hand, Batman offers his sidekicks the opportunity to fight alongside him in his crusade against Gotham's crime. On the other hand, Batman's rigid moral code, particularly his uncompromising stance on justice, creates a psychological framework that influences how these younger heroes approach crime fighting. Batman's role as a mentor is shaped by his trauma and psychological isolation, which prevent him from forming the emotionally supportive relationships that are crucial to effective mentoring. As a result, Robin, Batgirl, and other allies struggle to reconcile Batman's high moral expectations with the reality of crime fighting in a city as corrupt and dangerous as Gotham. The relationship between Batman and Robin provides a clear example of how Batman's psychological struggles affect his mentorship. Robin, particularly in his early years, is eager to prove himself and take on the role of a hero. However, he is constantly bound by Batman's moral code, a code that forces him to adopt the same rigid principles as his mentor. While Batman's no-kill rule is a reflection of his own personal trauma and moral absolutism, it becomes a psychological burden for Robin, who, as he matures, begins to question the effectiveness of Batman's approach to crime fighting. Robin's moral compass, while influenced by Batman, starts to diverge as he recognizes that Batman's refusal to kill criminals does not solve the underlying problems of Gotham. Rather than creating a city built on reform and justice, Batman's approach only recycles the same cycle of violence and corruption, where criminals are arrested but never held accountable long-term. This psychological disconnect between Batman and Robin leads to a growing tension between the two. Robin becomes frustrated with Batman's inability to compromise or adapt to the changing landscape of Gotham's crime. Robin's eventual departure from Batman is a direct result of Batman's emotional isolation and moral rigidity. Robin, who seeks a more flexible and adaptive approach to justice, cannot reconcile with Batman's uncompromising stance, leading to a psychological break. Batman's fear of failure and inability to evolve emotionally become the barriers that prevent him from mentoring Robin in a way that allows the younger hero to develop his own moral identity. Instead, Robin is forced to follow in Batman's footsteps, perpetuating a cycle of psychological dependence on Batman's moral code and methods. Similarly, Batman's relationship with Batgirl reflects the same psychological tension between the mentor and mentee. Batgirl, despite being an incredibly capable hero in her own right, finds herself constrained by the moral framework Batman imposes. Batman's belief in his absolute moral code prevents him from giving Batgirl the autonomy to make her own decisions or form her own moral principles. Like Robin, Batgirl becomes psychologically reliant on Batman's authority, and while she respects Batman's dedication to justice, she becomes increasingly frustrated with the lack of flexibility in his approach. Batgirl, unlike Robin, does not leave Batman's side in the traditional sense, but her relationship with him becomes marked by distance. She eventually starts to form her own identity as a hero, taking on a more individualistic approach to crime fighting, which reflects her psychological growth and the moral flexibility that Batman's rigid moral code denies her. This generational tension creates a cycle of emotional repression that is difficult for Gotham's younger heroes to overcome. Batman's psychological struggles prevent him from being an effective mentor, as he fails to empower his allies with the freedom to make their own moral choices. His fear of becoming like the criminals he hunts leads to an overprotective attitude toward those he mentors. Batman's moral absolutism keeps his sidekicks emotionally stunted, as they are constantly forced to adhere to his rigid principles, even when it becomes clear that Gotham's problems cannot be solved by simple black and white thinking. The psychological consequences of this mentoring style are profound, as Robin and Batgirl are left with the belief that they cannot operate outside the moral framework set by Batman. This psychological dependency on Batman's rules prevents them from fully developing their own approaches to crime fighting. The influence of Batman's moral code also extends beyond Robin and Batgirl. Characters like Nightwing, Huntress, and the Bat family as a whole are all impacted by Batman's role as a mentor. While these heroes might break away from Batman at various points, they still carry his psychological influence with them. Each hero, in trying to establish their own identity, finds themselves in a constant battle with the legacy of Batman's moral code. For instance, Nightwing may operate as a more flexible hero, but his roots are deeply entrenched in Batman's belief in absolute justice, and even as he develops a more independent approach, Nightwing cannot completely escape the psychological baggage that comes with being Batman's sidekick. Gotham's future heroes are psychologically conditioned to operate under a framework where justice is defined by individual action and not the institutional systems that Batman, in his psychological isolation, refuses to address. The moral absolutism passed down from Batman keeps these heroes tied to his methods, perpetuating a cycle where Gotham's future is always shaped by the same failures Batman tries to escape. The bat symbol is perhaps the most powerful and enduring aspect of Batman's identity. To Gotham citizens, the bat is a symbol of fear, justice, and retribution, but to Batman, it represents something even more profound. It is his moral code made manifest. The bat is a symbol of Batman's refusal to allow chaos and corruption to take root in Gotham, but it also serves as a psychological defense mechanism, distancing Batman from his own humanity. The bat represents Batman's need to control his environment and maintain his moral purity, but it also prevents him from truly engaging with his own emotional vulnerabilities. Batman's adoption of the bat symbol marks the point at which he divides himself from the person he once was, Bruce Wayne, and transforms into the vigilante hero who will stop at nothing to impose justice on Gotham. By using the bat as his symbol, Batman is not just fighting crime, he is fighting his own identity, attempting to become something more than human, something that transcends the trauma of his past. Batman's psychological need to distance himself from his humanity is further evidenced by his use of the bat as a mask, both literally and symbolically. By adopting the bat symbol, Batman rejects his own identity as Bruce Wayne, the man who was once vulnerable and who suffered from the trauma of losing his parents. Instead, the bat becomes a shield that allows Batman to operate without guilt or fear. It separates him from his true self. The bat symbol is a psychological mask, and in wearing it, Batman dehumanizes himself, forcing his psyche to compartmentalize the emotional trauma of his childhood. He refuses to confront the pain he experienced, choosing instead to embrace the bat as his only identity. This separation of Batman from Bruce Wayne deepens his psychological isolation as he becomes more entrenched in his role as a vigilante and less able to acknowledge his personal needs. By rejecting Bruce Wayne's identity and hiding behind the bat, Batman fragments his sense of self, making it difficult for him to ever achieve emotional integration. The psychological fragmentation that Batman experiences through his reliance on the bat symbol is compounded by his moral absolutism. Batman's rigid adherence to his moral code, the no-kill rule, and his insistence on justice further reinforces the psychological split between Batman and Bruce Wayne. While Bruce Wayne is a man who craves connection and emotional healing, Batman is defined by his need for control and order. This division prevents Batman from acknowledging the reality of his emotional pain. His need to impose justice on Gotham at all costs leads him to suppress his own humanity as he chooses to live as a symbol rather than a person. The bat, in many ways, becomes the force of his self-punishment, a constant reminder that Batman is not Bruce Wayne. He is someone beyond human. The more Batman clings to the bat symbol, the more he rejects his true self, preventing any true healing from occurring. The very symbol that was meant to give him power and purpose ends up fragmenting his identity, keeping him locked in a psychological loop where Batman is a means of control, but not a path to personal resolution. This fragmentation extends to Batman's relationships with others, particularly with those who seek to connect with him emotionally, like Alfred and Robin. As Batman isolates himself behind the bat symbol, he prevents his allies from truly seeing him not just as a hero, but as a man with emotional needs. The moral code that defines Batman's actions becomes an emotional barrier, preventing him from building authentic connections with others. While Alfred may serve as a caretaker and surrogate father, his role is limited by the fact that Batman refuses to acknowledge the emotional connection they could have. Alfred is often relegated to the role of a practical assistant, a witness to Batman's crusade, but not a true confidant. Similarly, Robin, as Batman's closest ally, experiences the emotional toll of Batman's refusal to open up. Despite their shared mission, Robin often finds himself unable to connect with Batman on a deeper level and eventually grows frustrated with Batman's emotional repression. This emotional distance between Batman and his allies is a direct result of his psychological fragmentation, his need to maintain the bat symbol as a shield from his own vulnerabilities leaves little room for emotional intimacy or genuine human connection. The psychological cost of Batman's reliance on the bat symbol also manifests in his role as a mentor to Gotham's next generation of heroes. Characters like Robin, Nightwing, and Batgirl all seek guidance from Batman, but they find themselves caught in the same moral paradox that defines Batman's life. Batman's moral absolutism, his insistence on never compromising on his code, forces his mentors to operate within a rigid system, preventing them from developing their own identities as heroes. This dynamic reinforces the cycle of psychological dependence that Batman creates, as his allies are trained to follow his lead and live by his rules. While Batman may believe that his strict code of justice is necessary for the city, he ultimately locks his allies into the same moral framework, preventing them from forming their own solutions to Gotham's problems. Batman's fear of failure, rooted in his trauma and moral rigidity, keeps him from empowering his mentees to develop their own methods of crime fighting. This dependence on Batman's moral framework creates a stagnation in Gotham, where the same problems are solved by the same methods that, while effective in the short term, fail to address the deeper systemic issues that plague the city. In conclusion, Batman's moral code, deeply intertwined with his psychological struggles, shapes not only his identity as a hero, but also his relationships with the world around him, particularly Gotham and its people. While his unwavering commitment to justice, symbolized by the bat, is admirable in its intention, it serves as both a shield and a barrier, preventing Batman from confronting his emotional pain and growing beyond the trauma of his past. His refusal to compromise on his moral code, especially his no-kill rule, keeps him trapped in a cycle of self-sacrifice and emotional repression, isolating him from those who care about him and limiting his ability to form meaningful, emotionally fulfilling connections. The psychological fragmentation caused by his dual identity as Bruce Wayne and Batman leaves him unable to reconcile the human with the vigilante, further deepening his isolation. Gotham as a city remains dependent on Batman's intervention, as his moral absolutism prevents Gotham from developing its own sustainable systems of justice. The more Batman fights to uphold his personal sense of right and wrong, the more he reinforces the dysfunctional cycle of vigilantism, crime, and corruption. His moral code has inadvertently created a city that looks to him and him alone for justice, while neglecting the need for institutional reform and community-based action. Ultimately, Batman's journey is a complex psychological struggle between moral purity and human vulnerability, between justice and self-punishment. His legacy as Gotham's protector is defined by his commitment to a rigid moral code, but this same code becomes the psychological cage that prevents him from ever fully healing from his past and growing into a more emotionally whole person. The psychological toll of this moral absolutism not only shapes Batman's personal struggles, but also leaves a profound impact on Gotham's future. A future trapped in a perpetual state of crisis and dependence on Batman's vigilantism. In the end, while Batman's dedication to justice and his uncompromising moral code are central to his identity as a hero, they also underscore the emotional and psychological costs of living a life defined by self-sacrifice, fear, and isolation. Batman's journey is not just about fighting crime, it is about battling his own inner demons and reconciling the moral absolutes that define him with the human vulnerabilities he refuses to acknowledge.